Can you see that?
Yeah, looks great. Thanks, Romesh.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Rahan. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. I wanted to talk about our work at UNFPA on civil registration, vital statistics, and legal identity. And this is really a substantial area of our work in terms of trying to make everybody count. What we'll emphasize today is elements of a major initiative, a global initiative, which is called Converge, Connecting Vital Events Registration and Gender Equality. So how do I progress forward? Here we go. Great, but first let me start by a quick introduction in terms of what we do at UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund. Do a whole bunch of things, big areas of our mandate cover sexual reproductive health and rights and ending gender-based violence and harmful practices. I'm going to, focus more on the part of the fund that I work in, which is really about strengthening national population data ecosystems and improving demographic intelligence and analysis and estimation of major population dynamics. And this is largely framed by major mega trends that, different parts of the world are going through, right from aging through to massive urbanization, more migration than ever, increasingly protracted conflicts and cross-cutting inequalities. And what we do is largely support low and middle income countries in strengthening their census taking and census analysis efforts, as well as improving civil registration and vital statistics systems. And this, really kind of spans what we call the sort of humanitarian peace building and development nexus around the world. And we particularly pay attention to advancing population data systems and demographic analysis in support of sexual reproductive health and rights and gender equality and women's empowerment. And also a major area of the fund's work is supporting adolescent and youth empowerment. Okay, but today we're going to talk about CRVS. What's CRVS? Civil Registration and Vital Statistics. And, here I've just kind of shared with you the official definitions, in terms by the United Nations in terms of what civil registration is. It's something that I think most of us in high-income countries take for granted. The universal compulsory permanent and continuous recording of vital events by a national authority. For people like ourselves in, say, Canada or North America at large, it's pretty hard to have a vital event. It's pretty hard to be born or to marry or die without the state knowing. You actually have to go to a lot of effort to be born or to die in usual circumstances, and keep under the radar. That's actually not true for most of the world's population. It's actually the exact inverse. Birth registration, death registration, these are multi-step processes. And in fact, most of the world's population are born and they die without actually being part of the official civil registration system of the country. Vital statistics really is about estimating the population dynamics through civil registration data, and the standards by the United Nations recognize that that civil registration data are the preferred source of vital statistics. I'm going to emphasize, and Sabrina's going to emphasize quite a lot, UNFPA's life course approach to civil registration from birth through to death, but also including marriage and divorce. Sabrina also will talk quite a bit about legal identity. So I want to share with you, what we mean by legal identity. It's literally, the basic characteristics of an individual's identity, name, place, date of birth, that are recognized through some sort of validation or certification registration process. That could be birth registration, or increasingly in many countries in the world, this is being done through national ID cards or even national ID credentials, which are purely digital. But at the UN, our emphasis is really about birth registration and all aspects of civil registration as the underpinnings of all legal identity systems. So this major initiative that we're involved in, Converge, is actually joint work with the Government of Canada. The International Development Research Centre in Canada hosts a International Centre of Excellence for CRVS systems. And so UNFPA and IDRC were the joint partners here on Converge. Our focus is really on the gender dimensions of civil registration and vital statistics systems across the entire life course. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's a couple of different aspects here. One is on the actual civil registration system strengthening itself. So that's a lot about systematic assessment of the completeness and quality of civil registration by sex and other key attributes like age and geography. But basically, trying to figure out who's included, who counts. But then secondly, understanding, what are some of the social and behavioral determinants that lead to systematic exclusion of people from civil registration systems? And what does that exclusion look like in terms of socioeconomic consequences? And then secondly, a lot of our work really is trying to promote a more gender inclusive culture of vital statistics production, dissemination, and usage. So I want to walk through fairly quickly 3 country case studies for you. I'm going to talk about some work around disentangling sex differentials in delayed birth registration and questions around systematic son preference in China. Secondly, I'll give you a little flavor of what marriage registration looks like in Kyrgyzstan. And, whoops. And then thirdly, I'll walk through what death registration looks like across different parts of Ecuador. Great. So first up, China. So there's been a large literature in demography and economics and social sciences, which highlights the somewhat skewed sex ratio at birth in China. The 2010 round of censuses showed an estimate of around 118 males per 100 females. That's pretty abnormal for human populations. The global average from the 2010 census round was about 105. And so a lot of distinguished demographers like Ainsley Cole and Judith Bannister and economists like Amartya Sen have analyzed census data from China and made conclusions that this is strong evidence of around anywhere between 30 to 40 million missing girls and women in China. So what I want to show you is what this looks like if we look more systematically across censuses and bring in what we learned from civil registration and some qualitative data. Here, what I'm showing you is what the sex ratio looks like when you back project the 2010 census data, right? So here you can see that you have a very skewed sex ratio right up until the later teenage years, right? Then if you go further and you look and say, okay, but what does this actually look like for the birth cohort of 1990 and let's track that birth cohort across the next two censuses in 2000 and 2010. And what you see is that the sex ratio persists as being fairly skewed in 2000, and then it normalizes, suddenly normalizes in 2010, okay? And so, you know, what this work is showing is that, you know, yeah, you know, there is just real skewness here. It's probably something of the order of about 14 million missing girls in China. But when you couple this with analyzing the civil registry, and you know, she and Kennedy in this paper in China Quarterly also bringing school records data and ethnographic research in rural parts of China, they show that this is actually, you know, this is evidence not so much as you know, such widespread sex selective abortion and female infanticide, but rather evidence of massive delays due to an administrative bias in terms of delayed birth registration, which is skewed towards females. And this has a lot to do with a behavioral response to the then one-child policy in China, and where, you know, many couples, you know, they did have a son preference, and then they'd wait for a son's birth before registering their daughter's birth, or they'd wait to register their daughter's birth because simply the fines of violating the one-child policy were quite large, and they needed to wait until they could afford those fines. Or they waited simply because, you know, you didn't really need a birth certificate until, you know, a girl child, you know, reaches adolescence and needs to go to middle school. And if you're, you know, in many parts of rural China, that may be outside of your home village, and you need to prove her age, and you need a birth certificate, you know. So really, you know, this is an issue of gender equality and women's empowerment. These sort of sex selective delays in birth registration really pose social protection risks for women and girls, and hinder their empowerment in critical early years of childhood and adolescence. But by really studying the census data, successive censuses alongside of civil registration data, you know, we identify a substantially, you know, this provokes, you know, substantially different policy ramifications, you know. So yeah, so here the estimates are around 30, the delays in birth registration account for around 73% of this observed skewed sex ratio. Let's move on, talk about marriage registration. This, unfortunately, is certainly the sort of often forgotten cousin of birth and death registration when it comes to civil registration. Here's what it looks like. This shows you that only about, what is that, 8 countries around the world or so have actually included questions on marriage registration completeness in the 2010 round of censuses. You know, using this kind of census data is a critical way to evaluate what the completeness of marriage registration looks like. Here's what it looks like in Kyrgyzstan. As you can see, there's about a 20% differential in terms of marriage registration for women, depending on their reproductive history. You see, you know, a substantially lower rate of marriage registration for women who haven't had a child. And what this points to is, again, building on this, you know, the example from China, people, you know, particularly in low and middle income countries, registering vital events only when they absolutely need to. And so here, you know, Kyrgyzstan, you know, the national laws and the sort of social norms really kind of require the registration of a birth to be coupled with proof of the couple's marriage being registered. Let me move to my third example, and you know, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, so I think this What I'm showing you here is the sex differentials in death registration across different regions of Ecuador. I want you to first focus on the vertical lines, the orange and blue vertical lines, which are showing you in orange what the average national death registration completeness looks like for females, and in blue for males. So it's, you know, around, you know, in the high, it's around 70% or so, and the differential is pretty small at the national level. But then if you glance up and down the page, you know, on the y-axis, I'm showing you the different administrative regions of the country. And you can see that, you know, across the country, death registration varies from around 80, 85% completeness in some areas of the country, right through to around 20, 30%. So, you know, depending on where you live, really, really different story in terms of how good our understanding of mortality dynamics, you know, is. But further, what you can see is that the spacing between the blue and orange circles in some areas is quite pronounced. And this is showing, you know, a substantial sex differential in death registration in particular areas. And so, why do we worry about this? We worry about this for many, many reasons, but mainly because it has huge implications for the ability of the health system to provide equitable healthcare to women and girls. You know, if you're not, you know, in order to help the living, we need to count the dead. And if we systematically, you know, are, you know, not able to observe the mortality experience and causes for women and girls, then this has major, major implications in terms of our ability to support population health, particularly for females. Let me stop there, and maybe we'll transition to the more interesting part of the presentation with Sabrina. Over